thank you for being here with our second of two fall talks with Andrew Watson. And I'll give you a brief bio of Mr. Watson. He'll go into his talk today on brain research and assessing brain research for the classroom, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. Andrew Watson began teaching in 1988, studying psychology and neuroscience in 2008, and combining these interests in 2012. Having taught high school English for 20 years, Andrew now translates brain science for teachers, students, administrators, and parents. As a consultant, he has partnered with schools and presented at conferences both nationally and internationally, focusing on memory, attention, and motivation. His goal: use research in cognitive psychology and neuroscience to make learning easier and teaching more effective. Since 2016, Andrew has written and edited the Learning in the Brain blog. He has also written 3 books: The Goldilocks Map, Learning Begins, and Learning Grows. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you, Barbara. It's always nice to hear such a nice introduction. And in fact, we are going to be starting our work together this evening. Is going to focus on the first of those books that Barbara mentioned. It's called The Goldilocks Map. And there's a little surprise at the end about the Goldilocks Map. So we can look forward to that. So thank you all for being here. I know this is a bit of a niche-y topic that we're talking about tonight. So the starting place for me in this work, those of you who spent time back in August in the session that we did, or back, what was it, a month ago now, Barbara, when I was here talking about long-term memory formation, you know that we're in a really exciting time when it comes to teaching, because the fields of cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience, educational psychology, and so forth, these have been around long enough so that we're starting to get really good research pools with really practical suggestions about what it is that we as teachers can do to help our students learn things. So we're not just making it up. We're not just relying on our guts. We've got some research behind this. So a month ago, we were talking about retrieval practice. Well, in our world, that's just flashcards, but it's really nice to know retrieval practice works. Or this summer, I spent a lot of time talking about working memory and the way we can think about working memory to think about classroom teaching better. And there's an enormous research pool about that. So I've listed 5 sorts of things that people might say, well, this is research-based teaching advice. You should do this. And there are probably several dozen more of these that you'll hear over the years. And to extend this thought a little bit, I want you to imagine that you attend a conference. And actually, I'll quit out of this slide here for just a moment. You're attending a conference, and the conference speaker tells you about this really amazing research. So I assume, Barbara, am I right that most schools, most of the participants here, you probably have skydiving programs in your schools. So you're really interested in skydiving research and parachute research. That's really interesting to you. So the research that was done in this case is about the usefulness of parachutes. And do parachutes provide any benefit is the question. So what they did is they worked with a bunch of participants, and several of them jumped from planes wearing a parachute, and several jumped wearing a weighted backpack. So the weight was the same. And what they measured is the rate of death or serious injury, both right away and a week later. And they found that there was no statistically significant difference between these 2 groups. So what they found in this research study is that parachutes really don't matter. Parachutes provide no benefit. There's no reduction in rate of injury. There's no reduction in rate of death. And this is, I think, really interesting and helpful research in schools. So your skydiving coach spends hours and hours and hours folding parachutes all the time, and that's really irritating, and would like not to have to do that. And your athletic director spends lots and lots of money on parachutes, and so she's happy not to have to do that. And parents love research-based initiatives. So if you can say, we're skipping the parachutes, research says so, all of this is good news. So this is, I think, a really useful study that we've got here. At the same time, when you go back to your school and share this research at your school, I suspect the skydiving coach will say, I have to say, I understand there's research saying what you're saying, but I also, like in my experience as the skydiving coach, I got to say the parachutes seem really useful to me. Like I get that there's research, but in addition to research, there's also the experience that the skydiving coach has. And by the way, that's true for classroom teachers as well. Yes, the research says do the thing, but we have experience as individuals. We have experience as a profession. We're bringing something to this conversation. So there's this really interesting balancing act that goes on when someone comes to a school and says, you should really change the way you teach because research says so. On the one hand, I think we as teachers should really be open to that possibility. And I've been working with Barbara now for hours and hours, talking with teachers about all the research that we have and all the ways that we can change teaching. I think it's important to be open to that possibility. And I think it's important for us to have confidence in our professional practice, confidence in our professional experience, that we not just say, oh, fine, whatever, if the research says so, I'll do it. I think we get to be partners in this conversation, and we get to be equal and informed partners in this conversation. So the hard part about that is research world is extremely complicated, and it's hard to sort of understand exactly what's going on and how to process it well. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about what it is that we can do if someone comes and says, change the way you teach, research says so. What are the steps that you can do and just follow? You do this, and then you do this, and then you do this, and you can, based on this, you can decide, well, yes, I will change my teaching practice because the research is good, or will you say, I've looked and I've decided that's not going to work in my world, I'm not going to do that. How do you get that balance right? So we're going to think about 3 phases of this. And as you can see, I've sort of framed this as a bit of a quest here. So you're a hero, you're out on your hero's quest. So for the first part of this quest, what we're interested in is deciding, well, do I trust the person who gave me this advice? Someone said, you should change the way you teach, research says so. Is that person behaving like a trustworthy source? I'll call this person the source. So that's the first question. And then the second question is, okay, I've decided that I trust this person, and now I'm going to come look at the research itself and say, well, does this research persuade me? And then the third piece, which is in some ways going to be the most fun, I think, is we looked at the source, we've looked at the research, now we're going to look at ourselves, and we're going to say, I need to check my assumptions, I need to do some deeper digging here. So there are going to be 3 phases to this quest. And as you can see, there are a lot of steps here. There are far too many steps to do in the time we have together. So I'm just going to pick 3 of these steps. We could have picked any others if we wanted. Just these are our fun ones that I like, and I think they're enjoyable to talk about. So this is our plan. By the way, if you want to take notes as we go, you're welcome to do that. There's no reason. Well, you certainly may. If you know about cognitive load and working memory load, it's probably a bit of a strain on working memory to take notes. But if you'd rather just use all your attention to focus on what I'm saying and what the slides are showing, I'm going to have a 1-page slide at the end that shows everything that I'm going to say tonight. So you actually don't need to take notes. You can just take a picture of the slide at the end and you'll be good because all the information will be there. So here are 3 phases. We're going to investigate the source, and then we're going to investigate the research, and then we're going to investigate ourselves. So to investigate, when someone comes and says, change the way you teach, research says so, this person is now our source. And what's the very first thing that we do? What do we do? And the answer is going to be surprisingly straightforward. There's a question that I'm going to tell you to ask. And it's an amazingly simple question. And here goes. The question goes like this. Well, thank you so much for the advice. What is the best research that you know about that supports that idea? And I suspect you're thinking, well, that's obvious. Why does he even need to write that down? What a silly thing to say. And part of the answer is I find people are incredibly hesitant to ask this question because it seems a little presumptuous. It's like, somebody said, research shows, who am I to ask? Well, you're the teacher is who you are. It's your classroom where the change is going to happen. You definitely get to ask this question. And the next reason to ask this question is that we're going to get 3 different kinds of answers, and the answers are incredibly helpful for letting us know what to do next. So the 3 answers are, you might get a right answer, and those are really easy to spot, and you'll know what to do next. And you might get a wrong answer, and those are really easy to spot, and you'll know what to do next. And you might get an incomplete answer, and those are easy to spot, and you'll know what to do next. So this right answer, what exactly is this right answer? The right answer sounds like this. I'm delighted you want to know. Let me give you the information. Here's the author, here are the researchers, here's the name of the study, maybe here's the journal. Like, here's the information you need. With probably a little enthusiasm. The people who do this work that I do, they should want you to want to know more. They should want that. They should be excited that you're asking. So if somebody says, I'm so happy you asked, here's the information you need, that's a really good sign. This is a trustworthy source. You can go on to the next step. The wrong answer is also pretty easy to spot. There are a couple different versions, and they sound kind of like this. I think it's sort of obvious. If anybody says, well, I can't give you the research and here's why, well, that's a perfectly ridiculous answer, isn't it? Research says you should change the way you teach, but the research is secret, so I'm not going to share it with you. That's preposterous. I once had a speaker tell me that he can't share the research with me because I don't have a PhD in neuroscience. And this is preposterous for a great many reasons, including the fact that the speaker does not have a PhD in neuroscience. So, like, it's an amazing, ridiculous thing to say. I will also say, and I'm a little more hesitant here, but attitude matters. If somebody gives you a little attitude about giving you the research, that should set off warning bells. So I'll give an example here. I spend more time on Twitter than I wish I did finding educational stuff. And somebody tweeted this out a couple years ago. Stop blaming the teacher if the students are on their phones, and blaming the teachers, because it's a proven fact that cell phones are as addictive as drugs. Huh. So I spend a lot of time hanging out in research world, and proven is a big world in research world. We don't use that world a lot. So I did what I do. I tweeted back and I said, I'm so curious to hear this. Could you share with me the research that you're drawing on to suggest that cell phones are as addictive as drugs? And here's his response. And the good news about his response is he sent me a couple of different links. So he's giving me links to the research that I need. And you'll notice here, he sent me a link to USA Today and to Vice.com, which are not famous for their research. And because I'm good at looking up research, I could find it past there. That's okay. But it was definitely a weird thing to do. But notice the tone here. And maybe I'm being oversensitive. Maybe I'm hearing something that isn't there. But it feels a little snarky to me. It feels a little, why are you asking? And the reason I'm asking is because you made a claim is why I'm asking. So it's not my job to look for the research to support your claim. It's your job to have the research to support your claim. And I will say, because of this tone, I was pretty skeptical about this. And sure enough, both of these newspaper articles cite the same study, and that study doesn't claim that cell phones are as addictive as drugs. It's not even trying to show that, much less showing that. And I sort of suspected that's where that was going to go, because there was a little bit of a go away kid, like, get off my lawn. There was a little bit of a tone there. So, wow, we're already making good progress. If somebody's excited, I asked, I know to go forward. If they refuse to give me research, like, I'm done. I'm not going to follow that suggestion at all. Now, there are 2 incomplete answers, both of which are useful. The first incomplete answer sounds like that. Oh, well, all the research shows that. Now, here's why that is an incomplete answer. In the first case, doesn't this sound like a polite version of this? It sounds like a way of avoiding answering my question, doesn't it? So it makes us nervous. The second reason this answer makes us nervous is, in the field of psychology and educational psychology, it is never true. Never. People are complicated. Learning is complicated. Teaching is complicated. If you put those things together, we're never going to get a research-based conclusion where everybody agrees on the answer. And people who understand research know that. No one who knows how research works would ever say all the research shows that. It's just not a possible thing. So I'll give you an example, probably of all the research-based teaching strategies that we've got, the one that has the best research pool behind it is retrieval practice. We talked about this a month ago, the idea that helping students recall things rather than review things, like so many studies. We've got lots of research on this. One of the key research in this field, her name is Pooja Agarwal. She wrote a book. She does a lot of research. She's a classroom teacher. She's great. So this is just, 2 years ago now. She went and found all of the research that she could find that doesn't just happen in a psychology lab, but actually happens in school classrooms. So it's even more persuasive because it was in an actual school. And sure enough, 92%, sorry, overclicked, 92% of the research studies she found showed at least a small effect, and a lot showed a medium or a large effect. But notice that 2% of the research showed no effect, and 6% showed a negative effect, that the other thing was better than retrieval practice. So even with retrieval practice, it's not true that all research shows that it's good. It's never true. So this is an incomplete answer. What do you do if you hear this? And the answer is, well, you say, oh, that's so wonderful. What's your favorite study? What study do you find most persuasive? And at that moment, if they say, no, really, all the research shows that, you're done. Do not follow this person's advice. And if the person says, oh, well, Pooja Agarwal wrote a great book. Here's this wonderful study. Let me give you a thing. Like if the second time you ask the question, you start getting an answer, we're back on track. But if they refuse to give you an answer, don't take that advice. This is not someone who's acting like they know what research says. Now, to understand the second incomplete answer, I want to offer a hypothetical example. So one of the things that's out there in teacher world is the benefits of shaking hands with students when they come in the door. So you might hear something like this. I'll let you read this claim. So perhaps this is a familiar sounding, this bunch of words all put together. This might be something like something you've heard before. So to explore this answer, I want to pretend for a minute that I'm a neurologist and I study migraine headaches for a living. And that's not true. I'm an end user of migraine headaches, but I don't study them for a living. So here I am, I'm studying migraines, and I use my fMRI and I use my EEG, and I look at the amygdala and I look at the prefrontal cortex. I look at the synapses and I check out the dopamine and the oxytocin. I'm doing the full neuroscience thing. And I notice a pattern that nobody has noticed before, sort of a neural signature, that when my patients have a particular kind of migraine, I see this collection of neural behavior. And I think to myself, well, if I could disrupt that neural signature, that might solve the migraine. So I set about coming up with something, and I develop a drug, and I've got a series of exercises, and I test it on the mice, and it's perfectly safe on the mice. And I test it on the human beings. And when I test it on the human beings, sure enough, it disrupts the neural signature. So I start the Watson program to alleviate migraines, and I sell my drug, and I make $1 million. Actually, hang on a moment. I think I skipped a step. I need to ask if their migraine headaches went away, don't I? Because if I disrupted the neural signature, but their headache didn't go away, it doesn't matter that I disrupted the neural signature, at least to the patient. The patient doesn't care about the underlying neurobiological stuff. The patient cares about the headache. That's what the patient cares about. And I'll go a step further. Let's say that my regimen doesn't disrupt the neural signature, but does make the headache go away. My patient doesn't care about the neural signature. My patient cares that the headache went away. Yes? So the underlying neural stuff is interesting to me as a neuroscientist, but it doesn't matter to the patient. The underlying neural stuff is really interesting to the neuroscientist, but not to the teacher. What we want to know is, did the student learn more? Whatever is going on underlying in a neurobiological way, it doesn't matter. Are they paying attention more? What is their motivation level? What is their stress level? How well do they cooperate? We want to measure their human interactive behavior. We want to know how their mind is working. And we're not actually really focused on what the brain is doing because it's really interesting, but it doesn't exactly matter. It's fascinating, but it doesn't help us do our jobs anymore. So when somebody says you should have your students shake hands at the door, I look at this and I say, oh, wow, that's a whole lot of neuroscience words. And this is the incomplete answer. If the answer sounds something like biology, if they're talking about cells, if they're talking about neurons, if they're talking about blood flow, if they're talking about neurotransmitters, if they're talking about GABA and glutamate and oxytocin, if they're doing brain biology stuff, all of that is neuroscience, which is fascinating, but it's not enough. It's incomplete. So we say, that's a really interesting neuroscience study. In my school, we only make changes to our practice if we see classroom research. Do you know of any psychology research to support your claim? We want psychology research in addition to, and maybe even instead of, neuroscience research. If the person says, what do you mean? Why do you need psychology? I just gave you the neuroscience. Don't take their advice. Walk away. You're done. If they say, oh, you're so right, here's a psychology study, well, now we're back where we want to be. So I hope I've persuaded you that although this question sounds incredibly simple, it turns out to be really powerful. We know what the right answer is. We know what to do. We know what the wrong answers are. We know what to do. We know what the incomplete answers are. We know what to do. So let's check this out with our parachute study. So the speaker says, parachutes aren't useful. So I go up to the speaker after the talk and I say, oh, speaker, this was so interesting. My school has the state championships. My school is the state champions of skydiving. What research do you know that supports this recommendation? And they say, oh, I'm just delighted you asked. Here it is. This is the study by Robert. Yeah, it's about parachute use. And as you can see, the objective of this study is to determine if using a parachute prevents death or major traumatic injury when jumping from an aircraft. So our confidence is really ramped up a level here. The source made a claim. I asked about the research. The source answered the question enthusiastically. So at this point, I'm much more willing to go forward with this plan. Okay, we're making some headway here. We've accomplished our first set of goals here. So there are other steps we could do to check out the source, but let's imagine like the source passes muster, all is good. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to explore the research itself, which might sound a little scary, but trust me, there are things we can do here. We can make this work. And what we want to do is start by asking a couple simple questions. We want to know, well, who was it when they did the research? Who was in this study? And what did they do? And crucially, are the who and the what my world? So we tend to think that research answers big questions like, is technology good or bad for learning? Research absolutely does not study that question. What research does is looks at the question, does this program on the iPad help neurotypical third graders learn division in a Montessori program? That's what research looks at. So then I need to know, well, if I teach math in a Montessori program, that's really helpful research to me. But if I don't, maybe it's not. So let's imagine that I'm interested. I hear about the benefits of taking exercise breaks in the middle of class. And I follow my steps and I say, well, that's so interesting. What research do you know of that supports the idea that I should interrupt class to do exercise breaks? And the speaker says, oh, this is wonderful. It's a great study. The researcher's name is Barbara Fennessy. And it's got this really memorable name. The study is called Sweat So You Don't Forget. So it'll be really easy to look that up. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. It's a great study. So I go and I look it up. And by the way, if you're interested in how do we find things, it's actually not as hard as it might seem. So let me know and I can give you some tips on that. And the first of our questions is amazingly easy to answer. When we want to know who was in the study, basically every study anywhere is going to have a section called participants. And the prose is going to be a little stilted, but you can read it. It's not that hard. And what we find here is the participants in this study, there were 77 college undergraduates at a Canadian university. 4 to 5 of them were women. That's who was in this study. And so now I'm going to ask, well, is that a good fit for my world? So I don't teach college, I teach high school, but like I'm not like that's not a huge age difference. I feel pretty comfortable taking college research and applying it certainly to my seniors. Maybe I mostly teach sophomores, so maybe to my sophomores, but definitely with my seniors. I teach at a co-ed school, so maybe if I taught at an all-boys school, maybe I'd be nervous about this study because it's 80% women, but I don't, so that doesn't bother me. So I'm sort of inclined, the participants are a good match in my world. But if I taught second grade, maybe not, for instance. And then what did they do? And the answer is, well, what they did is they did an exercise break during a lecture. And this is the piece that's really going to jump out at me, because what this study says is that these exercise breaks are helpful, but they're helpful on the assumption that what's happening in the class is a lecture, which is what happens in universities. So that's really useful. But I, as a teacher, I might do like a direct presentation of information for 5 minutes, maybe 10. That's really rare. But none of it is lecture. And most of the class is some sort of interactive discussion and sort of working with the stuff that we're talking about. So I'm not opposed to the idea of doing exercise breaks in class, but it's not clear to me that I should do this because I just don't lecture very much. That it's not really an awesome fit for what I do. Maybe, but maybe not. And again, the key headline here is basically that people are different, that the research that I should look at should match the context that I'm in. So I'm always trying to get this balance right, that I want to be open to the idea that research might persuade me to change my mind, but also sort of be thinking, well, if I teach in Seoul, South Korea, or if I teach in Reykjavik, or if I teach in Buenos Aires, or I teach in Anchorage, Alaska, then research that was done in New Jersey might not fit my world. If I teach in a military academy, then research that was done in a Waldorf school probably doesn't help me. If I teach kindergarten, then research done with 7th graders might not be a good match. I'm always trying to get that balance right. So let's, again, apply this to our skydiving study. So who was in this research and what exactly did they do? And so, as we know, what we found is that the parachutes didn't make any difference, that, both groups had, statistically speaking, equal measures of death and injury. So who are the participants and what did they do? And the answer to what they did is the participants, they jumped from an altitude of 0.6 meters. So for those of us who don't do meters, 0.6 meters is maybe like about that, I think. And the planes from which they jumped were traveling at a velocity of 0.0 kilometers per hour, which, just to be clear about this, they jumped from planes that were parked, right? So there's actually the study includes a photograph. This is what they did. So when participants jumped from this wearing either a parachute or a weighted backpack, well, literally no one was injured. Literally no one was killed. So in this set of circumstances, it is true that the parachutes didn't make any difference. But as the researchers themselves said, the trial was only able to enroll participants on small stationary aircraft on the ground, suggesting cautious extrapolation to high altitude jumps. So we should not take this research and use it to persuade our skydiving coach not to use parachutes, because that set of circumstances is very different from the set of circumstances where the research was initially done. Now, I do want to offer a specific word of caution when we start thinking about the match between the research and your world. I don't do a lot of rules. I don't have a lot of nevers, but here's a never if you want one to write down. Never, never, never change your teaching practice based on research into non-human animals. Never change your teaching practice based on research into non-human animals. Did the jazz music help the rats solve the maze faster? That's lovely for the rats. You don't teach rats. We need to see research done with people first. And this might sound like a ridiculous thing to have to say, but this happens. So this is a study I found. Does dim light make us dumber? Spending too much time in dimly lit rooms and offices may actually change the brain's structure and hurt one's ability to remember and learn. So who were the participants? The participants were Nile grass rats. What I would like to know is, how much time do Nile grass rats spend in their offices? So if when you look at the research, you find that the participants in the research weren't people, and they weren't people that look a lot like your people in your context, this is not research for us. All right, we are making good headway. It seemed like a really big task that we had, but we just asked a couple simple questions, and we found we've got some really powerful ways to make decisions, yes or no, one way or the other. So this next piece, now that we have looked at the research, and again, there are other questions we could ask, and there are other ways that we could explore that, but let's move on and think about ourselves here. And for me, the starting place is this really quite lovely quotation. I think I read this in a book by Adam Grant, but I don't remember whom he was quoting. It's a rare person who wants to hear what she doesn't want to hear. Which is to say, once we've decided to do something, like, we want to do it. So my suggestion is, once you've gotten to this place and you said, ooh, I've looked at the source holds up. I've looked at the research holds up. I'm in, I'm committed. I've decided I'm going to do it. I'm all in. Before you're all in, before you make the decision to change your teaching practice, say, actually, I'm going to go look hard and see if I can find research that contradicts what it is that I want to do. Can I disprove the claim that I hope is true? Which is to say, this is our chance to be the person who wants to hear what I don't want to hear. I want to believe that these mid-lecture exercise breaks will help. So I'm going to go look and see if I can find contradictory research. So let's say I've decided that, like, these exercise breaks, or I want to do this, and again, this was the research study here. So what I want to show you now are 3 websites where I spend a great deal of time because they're really helpful for exploring claims. And again, you don't need to write these down. They'll be on the handout at the end. So the first of these websites is called cite.ai. You can see this up here. And that's a little pun on the word citation. And the way cite works is I'm going to put in, you see there's a little search, oh, there it is. There's a little search box right here. So I'm just going to put in the Barbara Fennessy study information, and it will go and look for all the research it can find that cites Barbara Fennessy's study. And it's going to tell me how many people just cite it and say, hey, this study exists. How many people cite it and say, but we disagree with her conclusion. And how many people cite it and say, we agree with her conclusion. So how many other people agree with what she said? So I've done that search already. Here we are. And again, sweat so you don't forget, it's the same title. And I'm just going to scroll down a little bit over here. Oh, I need to unclick this box. So the math here is pretty easy. We can see that 23 different other studies have cited this one. And we see that none of those studies contradict Fennessy, so that's good. And 20 of them mention Fennessy, so okay. And 3 of them seem to come to the same conclusion, so that's interesting. And if I want, I'm going to click on this here so I can, okay, and here are the 3 now, so I can look at them. All right, so exploring perceptions of cognitive load and mental fatigue in a pandemic era Zoom. Ooh, wow. That's a little nichey because I'm actually not teaching on Zoom anymore. So I'm not sure this is going to be really useful for me because, well, I don't teach on Zoom, so not so useful. How about this one? Classroom movement, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, see here, we're back in university classes again. So again, this isn't bad that somebody did this, but if I'm teaching fourth grade, I'm not any more persuaded by a second study in a university than I am by one study. And this one down here, oh, wait a minute, this one's just a preliminary study. I didn't mean to click that. It's just a preliminary study to sort of think more about this research paradigm. So having done this first thing, I didn't find any contradictory research, but I didn't find much support and certainly didn't find any support for my fourth graders. So what do I do? Well, here's the next thing I could do. Connected Papers flips the strategy around. Instead of looking for who cites the Fennessy study, what it does is it looks at all of the studies that Barbara Fennessy herself cites, and then it looks for everybody else who cites those same studies, and it creates this really cool spider web diagram to show you how all of these studies connect and interact with each other. So you can see we've got this spider web diagram showing it's really an enormous amount of information. So here's the Fennessy study. And the way to read this, there are two things that jump out at you. The first is, how big is the circle? Well, the more times a study has been cited, the bigger the circle is. And then the color, the dimmer it is, the older it is, the darker it is, the newer it is. So for instance, like this study right here, that says Watson, but it's not me. That's quite large because it's been cited a lot. And it's fairly dark because it's quite recent. So that's actually a good place to start. So what does this study say? The effect of classroom-based physical activity, blah, blah, blah. Results suggest that classroom-based physical activity may have a positive impact on academic-related outcomes, but it's not possible to draw definitive conclusions because so many different ways to think, that's interesting. Well, there's another big one over here. What does this big one say? A single bout of exercise improves motor memory. Well, I don't want to do a single bout, and I'm not interested. Like, I want them to learn about Shakespeare. I'm not doing motor memory, so I don't care about that. So here's a recent one. This one's pretty dark. How about this one? Increased levels of cortisol caused by acute. Okay, cortisol, that's neuroscience. I don't want neuroscience research. So here again, I was really excited about this mid-class exercise break thing. And I went and I looked hard. Can I find more research supporting this idea? And when I looked in the site way of looking things, I really couldn't find anything. And when I'm looking in the connected papers way, I'm not finding, I mean, maybe if I keep clicking circles, I'll find something, but I haven't found anything yet. No, I haven't found a lot yet. So the last of the bunch here is the most recent. It's called illicit.com. I'm sort of amused by this. I'm tempted to put in illicit, ILLICIT, illicit.com, but I worry what I'll find. So it's illicit.com. And the way this works is you just pop in a question. So here, the question I asked it is, do mid-class exercise breaks improve attention and learning? And then it goes and it looks for all the research it can find to answer that question. Oh, well, gosh, the first one it finds is the Fennessy study. So we already knew about that one. And then there's a second Fennessy study that cites the same thing. And then, so this one here, yeah, we're still with university lectures. Yeah, I gotta say, so I haven't found any research yet contradicting Fennessy. Nobody's saying we did this and it didn't have any effect. But I haven't found any research yet to give me confidence that this is a good idea for my students. I think what this means is I am probably going to go ahead and try it out, but I know that there isn't sort of a research slam dunk on this. We have interesting research suggesting it might be a good idea. So maybe I'll try it in my own classroom. and see if my experience is that it's a good idea. Or equally well, I could say, given how little research this is, and it's all in universities, I don't think it's a good enough idea to try in my classroom. So no, thank you. I'm not going to take that research-based advice, because there isn't honestly a whole lot of research, and it doesn't really apply to the world that I'm in. So what we can see is there's a lot that we can do to check out whether or not we trust the person who offered this to us in the first place. And there's a lot that we can do to explore the research itself. And there's a lot that we can do to kick the tires and say, well, not just is there one study that says it, but can I find a lot of research pointing the same direction or not? And the answer to that question will help me understand whether or not this is something that I should do. So we've come a long way on this quest of ours here. We looked hard at this skydiving study, and we decided, well, it's true. The research is persuasive that when you jump off an airplane that's parked on the ground, it doesn't matter. But we're going to go with the coach's belief that actually, when you're skydiving, Barbara and I strongly recommend that you wear your parachutes. Barbara, you're a cosign on that, I hope. And I hope in a broader way, I persuaded you that this balancing act that we're trying to do is a challenge, but it's a fun challenge, and it's a fun challenge that's totally worthwhile. So yes, we should be open to the idea that research can help us teach better. And yes, we should be open to the idea that our experience, the world that we teach in, that we don't have to take every research-based bit of teaching advice. We can stand up for our own experience and perspective, and we are equal parts in this conversation. Now, I promised you a little bonus at the end. So this is the book that I wrote called The Goldilocks Map. If you are interested in this topic more broadly, there aren't a lot of books in this field, but the first one was written by a guy named Dan Willingham. And if you know this field, you know he's a real leader in the use of research to inform teaching. His book is very different from mine. He takes a much more philosophical, epistemological, theory of knowledge perspective about how to think about these things. So they're very different books. But if Dan Willingham wrote it, it's a good book. And I enjoyed it when I read it first. So if you wanted to take a picture, that's the slide. Everything that I've said today is right there. So I will pause and leave it there. Barbara, my instinct is we can just have people. Oh, yes, Barbara, thank you. Think Again is the name of the book that Adam Grant, that quotation comes from. So any questions?
I had a question about the relevance of research. So I teach in a private school, and obviously independent schools are very different in practice from public schools. And I'm curious, I've read various other books, like I think there was one on empathy that I read that all of their research was in an independent school. And I remember thinking, well, this is great for me, but it's also not really relevant in the same way for a public school teacher, just because the audience. So I have a two-part question. Number one, as you have researched some of this stuff in education, do you find that more of the research takes place in independent schools or takes place in public schools? Just curious kind of what's out there. And then the second question is, do you feel like that is a significant enough difference when you've traveled around and talked to people that I should be kind of lesser tiering, I guess, public school research and vice versa? Or is it in terms of actual neuroscience impact in the classroom similar?
So to answer those questions in order, almost all psychology research is done with college undergraduates who are taking psychology courses. And in fact, when you take a psychology course in college, they have this clever little deal that they can't require you to be in the study. But what they can do is say either you have to participate in 3 studies, or if you don't want to do that, you can write an additional paper. And no one wants to write an additional paper, so all college students who take psychology courses participate in studies. So every journal of psychology everywhere is secretly titled The Psychology of Undergraduates Taking Psychology Courses in American Universities. The acronym to remember is the acronym WEIRD. which stands for Western Educated, Industrial, Rich, and Democratic. All psychology research is done in weird countries, almost always in universities in weird countries, almost always in the United States and Europe. Very little is done in independent schools. Relatively little is done in public schools, K-12 schools, because most of it's in colleges. The answer to your second question is, if you've heard me speak before, you've heard me say 100 times, don't do this thing, think this way. What I would say is, if you see a piece of research that fits in every way except independent versus public school, what I would do is use your own teacherly judgment and say, well, based on what I'm seeing them do, like, here's a description of what they did in the classroom. That kind of sounds like my classroom. That sounds right to me. I've been teaching for a while. That feels good. I'll do that. Go for it. And if you think, oh, wow, in my classroom, that's just not going to happen. Those are different worlds, but they're not, a 15-year-old is a 15-year-old. They're not different species. They're attending a different school. So I think you're right to include that in the mix, but I don't think there's a definitive answer, except to say, in my view, it's a little bit of a controversial view, but my view is the teacher gets to decide. When you look at the research and you say, well, I've looked at the research, I understand, but I got to say, that happened in a school, the social circumstances of which are so unlike the school where I work, that's just not going to happen. And by the way, Sarah, I'll just reiterate, because it's to me an important point and one easy to miss. You asked me about neuroscience research, but remember, I don't think you should look at neuroscience research. I think you should look at
psychology research.
Right. So I don't mean to be a jerk. I just want to point out, I don't have an opinion about neuroscience research other than we always need follow-up psychology research. Other questions?
Andrew, I was going to ask, do you feel like this area is a good area for what's, I think, is known, in the wider world as the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act? Are you familiar with the OODA loop? It came out of the military world, where you just it's basically you keep running these iterations just to make for better decision making. So you observe a situation, you orient it, like, okay, psychology students in college might or might not work with my group. Then you decide, okay, I'm going to give it a shot in this area. You do it, and then you observe what happened, reorient, decide, act. As you're talking about this to me, I'm thinking, you could give it a try in one area, see how it works. Maybe it works for math, but does not work for reading. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there to you. I was exposed to this OODA loop concept a good number of years ago, and I've just found it kind of helpful. I think it could also help students as they engage in the wider world, where they're deciding on information, that they too could use an OODA loop just to learn, because we're all going to make mistakes on judgments. But if you're continually reassessing, hopefully you make better decisions over time. And that's what the military believes that's the case. So I throw it over to you.
Yeah, so first of all, I think OODA loop would be a good name for like a retro pop band of some kind. They've got sparkly outfits and all. So that can be our America's Got Talent act. Yes, with an asterisk. And the asterisk is one of the very sad truths that we're coming to see in the world of education research with alarming consistency is that people are really bad at knowing what helps us learn well. That if you were here a month ago, you heard me talk about desirable difficulties, which is to say, if we make the learning hard enough, the result is long-term memory formation. But if you flip that around, from the experience of the student, the first several times through were hard. They kept getting things wrong. It was unpleasant. So students really dislike retrieval practice because it's harder than review. Students really dislike spacing and interleaving because it's harder than masking and blocking. So there are some research pools which are specifically saying the thing that makes you feel like you have learned it in the short term won't help you learn it in the long term. So instead, you should do the thing that makes you feel like you didn't learn it in the short term. So I guess what I'm saying is the loop needs to be, the observation in the loop needs to have a relatively long time frame, because otherwise, if what you do is you ask at the end of class, hey, kids, did you like that? If they say we hated that, oh, well, then we won't do it anymore. Well, the reason they hated it is they had to think harder, and the thinking harder is what's going to lead to the learning. I saw a question, should we look for peer-reviewed research? This is a complicated question. The short answer is probably yes. The reason peer review is controversial, there are many reasons peer review is controversial. It gets infighty, it gets catfighty. We can't be sure that just because it's peer reviewed, it's correct, and we can't be sure that if it isn't peer reviewed, it's incorrect. So there isn't an absolute correspondence between peer review and good, but it's a good first approximation. It's sort of handy and useful. One topic that I haven't talked about, but thank you for asking this question, it gives me a chance to smuggle this in. You collectively might have heard of a statistical technique called meta-analysis. And meta-analysis, instead of looking at one study, goes and it looks for every possible study. How many studies can I find about mid-class exercise breaks? It will go and find all of them and then do some really cool math and try and come up with one number. So in that case, it's helpful to get a meta-analysis. And by the way, that's not better or worse than all the other things. It's one of many steps. But if you look for meta-analysis, they will focus on peer-reviewed research, and that will be one useful filter. So short answer, most of the time, yes, but peer review doesn't guarantee correctness, and lack of it doesn't guarantee incorrectness.
Is there one, obviously there's a lot of resources we can access through public libraries and through systems like that. Is there one source or one tool that you recommend paying for, like as a teacher, that you were like, oh, if I was just doing teaching and not doing this research, that's what I would pay for?
No, I think so. All three of those tools that I showed you do have a membership version, but I believe they all three have a free version, at least when I signed up. Because I do this for a living, I do pay for them, but I think you can get what you need without paying for them. And honestly, if you do this a lot, I'd go to your school library and say, hey, this is a great tool, you should pay for this. I will tell you, there's an online tool I won't give the name of, but when I was in graduate school, I had access to this amazing research source. And when I became a consultant, I thought, I'd really like to have this in my own professional life. And I think I'd be willing to pay for it. So I sat down, I thought hard, and I said, okay, I'll pay $250 for a year of this. And like, if they really twist my arm, it's $300. So I reached out, $300. So I reached out to them, and I got an email back, and the person said, I'm so excited. Like, I've just been hired to start finding private individuals to use this rather than organizations. So you're my first person. Let me get back to you with a number. And she emailed me back, and her number was $1,600 a month. And I responded to her and I said, you do understand that that's a mortgage payment. You do understand you're asking me to spend as a mortgage payment. Like, are you, she did not respond positively to that. So, but the answer to your question, Sarah, is I don't know of anything I'd pay for. I will say, by the way, the three ones that I've recommended, I've test driven and recommended. Several months ago, I test drove ChatGPT, and I suspect it's gotten better since I tested it. But you may know that ChatGPT hallucinates, which is to say it literally makes things up. So if you, when I tested it, I said, oh, ChatGPT, what's the best research on this? And it simply made up citations. And when I went and looked them up, I said, like, dude, this doesn't exist. And they said, oh, I'm so sorry. And I said, does the next one on the list exist? And they said, yes, it definitely exists. And it definitely didn't. So I wouldn't use that for that purpose.
Well, guys, we're here at 8 o'clock, and given it's a Tuesday night and everyone's so busy, I think we'll wrap it up. And Andrew is always so nice. If you come up with another question, you've got his email. If you don't have it, I can find it for you, translatethebrain.com. And we really appreciate our fall time with Andrew this year, and we've learned so much from on interesting and novel topics for us. So thanks so very much, everyone, for being here. It turned out to be a great group, and I appreciate your questions and your involvement. We really appreciate it. And Andrew, thanks again. And we'll hopefully be talking with you soon again in the new year coming.
I look forward to it.
And everyone here, please put Saturday, December 2nd for our holiday luncheon on your calendar, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. Please make sure to register for it. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.